Let's start with a word of prayer. Dear Father in heaven, I thank you for this beautiful day. I thank you for the blessings that you have bestowed upon this church and giving us prophet to keep us from being deceived at the end times. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Ellen White took a lot of times in the great controversy to give us a pretty good insight of what was going to happen at the end of time. If you haven't read it, maybe for your Sabbath afternoon, read Liberty of Conscience Threatened. A lot of things going on, but there's some really big things that happened this week, things that haven't happened in 50 years. Anybody want to take a guess? Yeah, Roe versus Wade was overturned. There was another one that was overturned. Do you remember what that was? They ruled that a football coach could have prayer after words and that he wasn't infringing on their rights. Now, on both of those things, perhaps, I'm not being political here, maybe some of you were or were not in favor of those. On the surface, a football coach praying, what does that got to do with the government? But I would say to you, you might want to think if your kid is on that football team and the coach is Catholic and he wants to pray to Mary or wants to pray to a saint, what would you say? Hey guys. So that was the concern. It isn't that a coach can't have prayer on his own. It's just the team would feel like, hey, am I going to not be on first string if I don't go out there and pray with the coach after the game? And that was the concern. And the Supreme Court ruled that he had not infringed on the right. The other one, I think you know, Roe versus Wade, was overturned for 50 years. I'm not here to talk about whether that's good or whether that's bad. I want us to look at the view from 10,000 feet. You know, as the saying goes, they can't see the forest because of the leaves. You ever heard that phrase? Sit back and look at it from the perspective of the great controversy. What's going on? What's playing on? To do that, I want to first do a quick review of some of the end time prophecies that deal with the very end of time. Jesus said in Matthew 24:32, says, "Now learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and put forth leaves, you know that summer is near. So likewise, when you see all of these things, know that it is near, even at the doors." So I'm going to cover a few things that were talked about in the great controversy that would happen just before the Lord returns. Daniel 11:4, "And at the time of the end shall the king of the south push at him," him being the king of the north. And I want you to pray, because we're going to go into this, who is the king of the south? And notice the end. It says, at the time of the end. Daniel uses this phrase in a couple places, most noticeably in Daniel 12. And it says, "And at the end of time, there shall come a time of trouble such as never been or ever will be again." And Daniel asks, when shall these things happen? And the angel says, until a time, a times and a half. Then shall the end come. So we know that is code for 1,260 years of papal persecution. So the time of the end begins with basically the deadly wound of the papacy, right? So who's this king of the south? If you'll notice, the historians will point out that Napoleon, who is the emperor of France, marches across Europe, and he winds up taking the Pope captive, and the Pope dies in captivity. Symbolically, that sounds a lot, but we know there was another pope, and another pope, and another pope, and another pope, and another. Okay, so putting the pope into, he was put on an island and dying. That wasn't the deadly wound. What was the deadly wound? Well, when Napoleon goes across Europe, he destroys many, if not most, of the Catholic monarchies. So the King of France or the King of Spain are no longer in power. Now, what the Pope had done in the past is if he wanted a particular edict taken care of, he would call the king of that Catholic nation and say, I want you to put down these heretics. So in the case of King of France, he told King of France, assembled the Spanish Armada, and they were going to take England because England had a Protestant queen. And they also were going to pick up a whole bunch of French soldiers, and they were going to invade England. And if you remember the story, 3 gigantic storms came and destroyed the largest armada of ships until D-Day. That was the largest armada of ships ever assembled, and they lost 2/3 of them to the storm. During the time of France, the king there, the Huguenots, had become quite a Protestant movement, and they had to actually begin to get through to the king and the queen, and somebody wrote something horrible about the Mass. And the king flipped out, and they wound up massacring the Huguenots. He told them they had to come into town, and they had to pay a special tax. And he assembled the French dragoons, who was their cavalry, and they slaughtered 55,000 men, women, and children. The Catholic Church to this day celebrates that holiday. Following that, they went out and grabbed everyone they could, and they burned them alive at the stake. Okay? So when Napoleon goes across Europe and destroys these Catholic monarchies, the Pope can't pick up the phone and say, hey, there's a bunch of heretics, probably Protestants, put this down, right? So that is the infusion of the deadly wound. But the king of the south is going to raise as atheism. I'll get into a little bit more about that. This should just be a root. And it says, now we're dealing with the end of, or the time of the end. The king of the north shall come against him, the king of the south, like a whirlwind, and he shall enter into the countries and shall overpass them. So we're going to look at what time period is this? We just spoke about. It's the time of the end, right? Who is the king of the south? Who is the king of the north? And who wins? The answer is the time period is the prophetic end of time. The king of the south is atheism. The king of the north is the papacy. And who wins? Papacy. Ellen White said a book written by Uriah Smith called Daniel and Revelation. She said it was one of the most informative books ever written. If you're a gearhead on history like me, he gets into infinite detail. But he got towards the end on the king of the north, and he was living during the time of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire were the Turks, but they took quite a bit of the southeast, and he thought they were the king of the north. And Ellen White said, nope. King of the North's papacy, and it will remain the papacy till the end of time. And it is the king of the north that overruns the king of the south. The king of the south is atheism. So what's atheism? Well, I can think of communism, but there's also in this country have secularism. So when I went to high school, I was in 9th grade or 10th grade, I had to take biology, and my biology told us that they had proven through evolution that God doesn't exist. Of course, I'm a mushy-headed 10-year-old, 10th grader, I'm going, really? And I was thinking, fortunately, I didn't have that much respect for teachers back then. I thought, I don't think so. But a lot of people believed it, and a lot of people believe it to this day. So when I went to college, I had to take philosophy, and philosophy gets into science of logic. And this professor, I just saw him about 4 years later, If you read the book, A Trip to the Supernatural, Roger Minot says that any professor who professes evolution or anything that tears apart at the credibility of the Bible, that he will send a retinue of his angels. And in particular, Charles Darwin, Satan himself counseled Charles Darwin. This was to destroy the credibility of it. So I'm sitting in this philosophy class, and I talked a little bit on Sabbath school, but they flip. For the first 2 sessions, he does this review of who God is. He's all loving, he's all powerful, he all knows what's going to happen in the future. And I mean, he did a masterful job. I've never heard a pastor do such a good job. And we come in like day 3, and he flips on this projector, and he shows the most horrible atrocities, particularly to children. And he said, using the science of logic, this God cannot exist. For if he existed, how could he have allowed this to happen? If he was all powerful, he could have stopped it. If he knew it was going to come in the future, he would have stopped it. This God cannot exist. And as a young freshman student, we then went to our discussion classes, and the teacher, or the student teacher was leading out, said, well, how many of you still believe in God? And there was about 20 to 30 of us. And I think myself and one other girl kind of sheepishly held our hands up. And of course, okay, why do you believe that, after what you just saw? And I blurred out something about, well, I always thought this was kind of a test or whatever. For the next 3 nights, I did not sleep thinking about that. Of course, I would later read Why Was Sin Committed by Patriots and Prophets. But he said, why do you still believe? I heard this verse, and I hadn't been in church in a long time. It said, if you will not confess me before men, what's the rest? Neither will I confess you. And so I had a feeling that I'd pleased the Lord, but I couldn't answer the question at the time. Atheism is the king of the South. When Napoleon rises, if you remember, theirs is a godless revolution. America is a God-centered revolution, right? But theirs is a godless. They throw out all religion. They had suffered under Catholic persecution for so long, and the intertwining of the papacy and the royalty, and so they had a very terrible view. If to this day, when you go to a lot of these, thank you, honey. My voice is a little hoarse. Yes, sorry, folks. To this day, in much of Europe, it's very secular. They don't believe in any religion on that. So the king of the South is atheism, but it says that the king of the North overruns it, takes it. Okay? Now I'm going to introduce one other player here. It says, this is Revelation 19:20, and the beast was taken, and with him the false prophet that wrought miracles before him, in which he deceived them that had deceived the mark of the beast and them that worship the image. Now, there's a number of things in here I'd like to point out. The beast, who the beast is, who the false prophet is, who the mark of the beast is, and the worship of his image. So let's go through who the beast is. I think if you're Seventh-day Adventist, you understand that represents the papacy, right? Who's the false prophet?
Apostate Christianity.
Apostate Protestantism. Okay. What's the mark of the beast? What's the image of the beast? We'll go through it. The papacy, apostate Protestantism, Sunday worship, the union of church and state. Ellen White talks a lot about that. Great Controversy, page 445. When the leading churches of the United States, uniting upon such common points of doctrine as are held by them in common, here comes, shall influence the state to enforce their decrees and sustain their institutions. So the church reaches for the power of the state to enforce their beliefs, right? Then Protestant America will have formed an image of the Roman hierarchy, and the infliction of civil penalties upon dissenters will inevitably result. Remember what Jesus says? When you begin to see these things happen, whether you're for or against abortion, or whether you're for or against prayer in school, remember what she said. I'm going to touch on this one. The image of the beast represents that form of apostate Protestantism which will be developed when the Protestant churches shall seek the aid of civil power for the enforcement of their dogmas. Concerning Sunday law, the church appeals to the strong arm of civil power. Upon this will Papist and apostate Protestants unite. Anybody know what the coalition was that was the most instrumental in bringing about the change in Roe versus Wade? So apostate, I want to remember that word apostate Christian, when Protestant churches shall seek the aid. Most Protestant, a lot of your Protestants, but not all, a lot of your Protestants, and will use the word evangelicals, right? I went to their site to read what they had to say, and in particular about separation of church and state. And they said, what four things do evangelicals have? And they clicked them off. And the fourth one was the Sabbath. I thought, oh, that's interesting. So I read it. They said it is informative that we have unity, oneness. God cannot bless the body of Christ unless we have unity. And the unity is we all have one day of worship. What day do you think that might be? Okay? That was on their website. I didn't say it. So Roe versus Wade, I listened to a discussion, and they had a guy on it who's been following this real close, and he said, undoubtedly what did this was the union of evangelicals and Catholics. And he said, do not underestimate them. They are a powerful celebration. Now, some of us might say, well, you know what, that was a good thing with abortion. And maybe that's not your view. I'm not here to talk about that. But they joined. Now, you consider how many Catholic presidents have we had? 2 out of what are we, 45 or 46 now? 2. And then only in the last. And the reason is because we were a Protestant country. What do we mean by a Protestant country? When you put a Catholic in charge, their first loyalty was to their church. The second loyalty was to their nation. Okay, you go to Mexico. Mexico is a Catholic nation. So what the Pope says and does, in theory, they're supposed to do. Now, if you follow that, Joe Biden should be doing that, and he should have been for ending abortion, and he didn't. So I realize it doesn't always line up. Now, I want to touch on this apostate Christianity. Revelation 15 says, this is talking about Babylon, the great harlot. and upon her forehead was a name written, Mystery, Babylon the Great. What does it say? In the Bible, what does a woman represent?
Church.
So she's a harlot. She's what? Unfaithful to her master Christ, right? So she's the mother. Who are her daughters? Apostate Protestants, which God calls harlots, right? I went to their website so that I don't like when people talk about Seventh-day Adventists and don't go to our website to talk about us, right? How abortion unified Catholics and evangelicals became a power on the right. Over the next 4 decades, the religious right grew in strength. And they went through the whole history of how they came together. As did the Conservative Protestant Catholic Alliance. On January 31st, 2006, Samuel Alito was sworn in as Justice to the United States Supreme Court, becoming the 5th Catholic, then serving on the 9-person court, becoming the 5th Catholic, then serving on the 9-person court. I didn't realize this, but of course, since then we've had 2 more Catholics, right? Mm-hmm. Come on. And Thomas, who's the African American? Justice Thomas, Clarence Thomas. He converted to Catholicism. That stunned me on that. So we have a lot of Catholics on there. And this is it. So Catholics giving greater standing to both groups. By focusing on a common political agenda rather than on theological differences, they have been able to secure greater religious liberty forever to change the country. I listened to a discussion on that a lot of evangelicals supported Donald Trump. And the number one reason why they liked him was because of religious liberty. Now let me define religious liberty to them. Religious liberty means the government can't tell them that they can't pray in school. Religious liberty means they don't have to recognize gay marriage. Religious liberty means to them their hospitals don't have to perform abortions to get state money. Right? So if you'll notice, our school systems and our hospitals will not take money from the government. Because along with that comes stipulations, right? So I'm going to get a little bit into what they see as religious freedom. First Amendment, Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment or religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. Those of you who know this, a lot of our founding fathers were Protestants who were running from religious persecution. Little side note, were they running from Catholic persecution? Protestants. The Anabaptists were coming from what is present-day Netherlands, and they were running from the church of that area, and they taught infant baptism. And the Anabaptists said, you've got to be at an age of accountability, which we agree. And they thought that was such a horrible thing, because they thought if a child then died, they would instantly go to hell without being baptized as a child. So as punishment, men were burned at the stake and women were basically drowned, is what it would come down to. Church of England, Puritans were running from being persecuted by the Church of England. So when they came here, they said, look, we're not going to have any nation. So if you were born in certain parts, you were born in England, you're born in the Church of England. If you were born in Germany, if you're in the north half, you were a Lutheran. If you're in the south half, you were a Catholic. They said, we're not going to have any of that. You can be whatever you want. And I didn't know this, but a lot of the states formed based on their religion. So who do you think the Pennsylvania is? Quakers. Who do you think Maryland were? Catholics. And you go up in New England, and my wife and I go out to Cape Cod, and it's just filled with Congregationalist church. And some are older. They go back to the 1600s. So people tended to settle out by their religions. But we weren't a Baptist. We weren't a Quaker nation. We were an American institution. You could believe what you wanted to. Separation of church and state. Now, this is the thing that I think atheists beat us over the head with. So, if you ever do anything of any religious thing in school, well, they'll say separation of church, separation of church and state. So some kids wanted to meet before school and have a Bible class. And the school said, you can't do that. They took it to court, and they said, as long as it's not organized by a teacher, you can do that. Now, if the teacher wants to come in, but he can't lead out, that's the only thing. But if the kids want to have it, they can do that, right? Schools constitute a local extension of the government, which cannot make religion mandatory for all students. This clause in the First Amendment is called the Establishment Clause. That's what was challenged when the coach said, I want to pray right after the game, right? Now, he's leading out. And I think it would be normal if I don't go pray with the coach, I may not be on first string next week, right? There's certainly that thought. So I get what the coach is saying, but he should have done it in a different setting. My opinion. You can have your opinion. This means that schools cannot have assemblies which promote religion. And classroom teachers cannot promote one religion or non-religion, such as atheism, which my biology teacher did, by the way, over another one. The Establishment Clause limits the free speech rights of teachers, principals, and staffs when commuting with students. Now, this is their perspective. However, students and Christian leaders have free speech rights as explained in the students' rights sections. The term separation of church and state has been misinterpreted over the years by something that our founding fathers never meant to separate. Now, this is their view. This is the evangelicals' view. The term separation of church and state, or the term a wall separate. How many of you ever heard that? A wall separating church and state. This term has been misinterpreted over the years of our founding fathers. Never meant to separate the state and church. I beg your pardon, they did. But instead, just wanted to make sure the government does not interfere with religion. They just wanted to make sure that the government does not interfere with religion. But it's okay if religion interferes with the government. Especially that it does not officially establish one particular religion or denomination over another, or establish non-religion or religion. That part I totally agree with, all right? The intent of our founding fathers was to protect religion from government and not to exclude and separate religion from your government. What did Ellen White said would be the formation of the image at the end of time? Union of church and state, right? However, in Emerson versus the Board of Education of Ewing, case 1, changed all that in 1947. The case introduced the term separation of church and state for the first time in history. While it does not appear that making religion an outlaw in public schools was an intent of the founders, nor was it the practice in America in 1947, the Everson case set the stage for other challenges to religious practices in school. Daily prayer and Bible readings were challenged and dismissed from public schools, in the early 1960s. Again, this is King of the South, atheism. Other forms of official religion, religious expressions, came legally unwelcome in schools with the elimination of graduation prayers in 1992, and prayers before, we might add, after football games. Thomas Jefferson introduced the bill establishing religious freedom, which passed in 1779 and was strongly supported by James Madison. And it stated, "The duty we owe our Creator and the manner of discharging it can be directed only by reason and conviction, not by force. The religion then of every man must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man, and it is the right of every man to exercise it as these may dictate." I hope they'll remember this statement when they pass the Sunday law and they ask us to join this, because that has always been the end game for Satan. You see, you can't pass the Sunday law if you interpret the First Amendment to mean a wall separating church and state. And if you will see, our church, our religious freedom group, goes time after time to court to fight to make sure that interpretation of a wall separating church and state remains in place. The words "Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof" means in simple words that no power was vested in Congress to establish a national church and to compel by law worship of its tenets, which in return allows the free exercise of religion. This is the wall the Free Amendment erects, and that Jefferson was referring to. We're in 100% agreement that we want that wall there. What you're beginning to see now is that the evangelical Catholic movement is trying to remove the interpretation that there's a wall separating church and state, but they think that the church should be able to influence the state. And therein will lie the end battle. You're going to watch in upcoming events here, battles on the Supreme Court. They're going to be hitting on a number of these in quick succession. You might want to keep track of your religious liberty on where some of those are going to go and to what our church's view are on that. But what I most want to pick up, if you picked up nothing else out of today's sermon, it's that the union of the evangelicals in the Catholic Church has become a political force. Go on your website, just type in Evangelical Roman Catholic Church Union and look at the things that they're pushing, that they're in favor of. And that if you would have told somebody in the time that Ellen White, now she wrote this from the time of the Civil War, just a little bit after, that Protestants, Catholics would unite, she would have been laughed out. Many people brought to scorn this would never happen. In fact, they brought out in that article in the 1960s, a lot of evangelicals wouldn't have anything to do with it. I played on a softball league with our church, and we played with Baptists, Methodists, Presbyterians, but we also played with Catholics. But the Fenton Baptist pastor would not let the Baptists play against the Catholics because he didn't consider them Christians. Now, I don't think that's the right thing to do, but it just tells you where we've gone in a short period of time. Ellen White said that Protestants would be the foremost in reaching across the Gulf of the Atlantic to grasp the hand of papacy, to enforce their doctrines. That union is already formed. They are a political force. And in my opinion, the end game is not abortion. It's not school and prayer. It's the removal of the wall between church and state. And once that happens, the Sunday law and the law to worship the beast can now be in place, is now in place. Matthew 24:32, learn a parable of the fig tree. When his branch is yet tender and puts forth leaves, you know summer is near. So likewise, when you see all of these things, know that it is near, even at the doors.